Well, and friendly greetings to you, honorable guest, Dr. Jere Behrman, and to all the viewers who are following the 6th episode of The Voice of the Expert, which is a monthly program organized by the Center of Measurement and Evaluation in Education and Development. This program takes place in a particular context marked by the proliferation of a series of crises in our contemporary life, taking many forms: health, economic, social, political, environmental, etc. And of course, all the repercussions and effects that they induce at all levels. It's also changing and evolving context characterized by rapid global transformations and the emergence of new challenges such as knowledge explosion, technical development, and digital revolution. All of this requires seeking central and vital place for the expert in any field. The Voice of the Expert program aims to highlight characteristics, interests, and contributions of experts in various fields. It also aims to find out their expectations and prospective perceptions on different topics in their fields of expertise. Today is the 6th episode of this program, in which I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome and interview our dear guest, Dr. Jere Behrman. Thank you, Professor Dr. Jere, for accepting this invitation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I start by quickly introducing our honorable guest, who has great CV with several activities in teaching, leadership, consulting, and research. Professor Jere Behrman is a leading international researcher in empirical microeconomics. He belongs to 1% of highest ranked economists worldwide. He is a professor of economics and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He has worked as consultant for numerous international organizations and various governments, especially for a long duration with the World Bank since 1975. His research is in empirical macroeconomics, economic development, early childhood development, labor economics, human resources, education and nutrition, economic demography, household behaviors, life cycle, and intergenerational relations, policy evaluation, etc. In these areas, he has published over 500 papers and more than 35 books. He has been principal investigator or investigator on over 160 funded research projects. He has received several of honors like awards, Society and Foundation Fellow, Doctor Honoris Causa, etc. Without delay, the first words for you, Dr. Jere Behrman, before we begin to address axes of this episode.
Very good.
Okay, so the interview will be articulated around 4 axes. The first one concerns professional experiences and consulting activities. The second, research interests and contributions. Third, the nature of career, and finally, the future perspectives. So now we start with the first axis, professional experience, and consulting activities. The first question, Professor Dr. Jere, you have obtained a bachelor in physics with highest honors. Afterwards, you turned to economics in master and PhD. Why this conversion? And has your scientific mind, especially in experimentation, served to build an excellent path in economics?
Thank you for the question. I was very engaged in physics. I liked physics a lot. I think I did well in physics as an undergraduate. As part of preparing for physics, I had studied English, my native language, German, the second most useful language in those days in physics, and thought it'd be useful to study Russian, the third most useful language for studying physics when I was undergraduate in the 1950s. I engaged in a program which had exchange students between the United States and the Soviet Union and spent a number of weeks in the Soviet Union during the second summer of that program. We were to speak only Russian. I spoke only Russian. I am not so good at languages, but I struggled through the Russian. But I got more and more interested in international experiences and in particular, international development, partly because of the Soviet experience, but partly because of the much broader experience in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I tested the waters. I applied to graduate school in both physics and economics. I went for a year in economics and liked it enough that I decided to continue. As I said at the start, I found physics exciting and interesting, but I also thought it would be several decades before I would have any time to do anything other than physics. Whereas in economics, I could follow other interests about how society was developing as part of the work. I think the physics background helped particular in terms of quantitative dimensions of economics, partly some exposure to experiments, as your question suggests, but probably more important, exposure to systematic modeling and how to think about modeling in a tractable and simple way, complex phenomena, which carries over from physics to economics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Dr. Jere. Question two, you have held several academic positions. What you consider your own best practices in teaching, assessing, supervising and advising students, and finally doing research. So what you practice and enjoy as a good.
I've been fortunate in recent years to be teaching primarily seniors, undergraduate seniors, in a course which focuses upon their senior theses. So I say fortunate because this is a group of very capable and very highly motivated students, but a group which has had in the US system much less depth in terms of economics than they would in most countries, including your country, including Morocco, and virtually no experience in undertaking independent research. So the purpose of this course is to provide a framework, a structure for them to choose a topic of their interest, learn what previous students have done on similar topics, learn what professional articles on similar topics look like, and then write a thesis of their own. So it's a question of providing a balance between a framework for support and letting them learn and explore and make their mistakes and learn from their mistakes. In such work, for example, critical for most students is locating good data to use in their analyses. And that takes time and effort and develops some skills. It's something the students tend to think beforehand is very easy. I have this good idea, I'll download some data and I'll explore this good idea. But they find out in the practice to be able to make a contribution for that idea requires sometimes protracted search for information and data. And finally, a plus of this course for me is the students have very varied interests. We're in a U.S. university, so the majority have interest in the U.S. economy, but a significant minority have interest in other economies, and also in a range of questions about those economies. For just one example, in your neighborhood, one of the students this past year wrote his thesis upon the role of middle school examinations predicting success in high school and in college applications in the country of Tunisia. And he had access to very good data from Tunisia, and used the fact that for the high schools, there's a cutoff for admissions. You have to have a minimum score for admissions for the elite high schools. And so some students were right above that cutoff, some were right below, and those students right above and right below are very comparable. By comparing those two groups of students, he was able to tease out the impact of attending the elite high schools as opposed to only the impact of being selected to attend the elite high schools. And I don't know the Moroccan education system, but my guess is it is similar in this way, with these high stakes exams at various levels determining whether or not students can go on, or whether they can go on to the highest quality kind of education.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the same question, Jerry, but now for administrative positions. What you consider your own best practices in managing human, material, and financial resources?
In this area, I think it is critical to be well organized, which in my case means a number of Excel spreadsheets for different projects or different activities. I think it is also critical, and I would say this for the teaching as well, to be responsive to the needs or the perceived needs of the people with whom one is working. And part of being responsive is responding quickly when there's an inquiry or when there's a question. Part is trying to develop the capacity for understanding well what they are saying, what issues they have, whether you think those issues are legitimate or they should think more about what the issues are and moving forward with them. But I think I think being timely is very important. When you're in one of these roles and someone contacts you, it's something that's on their mind. Something that's on their mind now. And if you wait 2 weeks to send them an email saying you'll get to it, an opportunity is missed to engage with them about the issue when it's very, very live and very important to them. So I think that's an important part of the process.
Okay, thank you. Question 4. You conducted several consultations with many national and international organizations in different fields and for a variety of subjects, in particular with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the UNICEF, and others. What are the important subjects of these consultations and what are your main contributions?
In addition to the international organizations you mentioned, I also have worked with a number of governments. And the work, in a way, has been very similar. In recent years, this work has been primarily on various dimensions of what I would call human capital or human resources. Excuse me.
Okay.
By that, I mean education, broadly defined, but also health and nutrition. My work has been with these organizations primarily on low and middle income countries. And in such countries, an important form of human capital is the health and the nutrition of children. And if their health is bad or their nutrition is poor, they're not likely to be able to learn much from formal education. So most of my consultations have been upon various programs for improving the health and nutrition and education of children in developing countries. The most notable of them is probably originally with a particular government, Mexico, although subsequently with the World Bank and with the Inter-American Development Bank. And that's on programs called conditional cash transfers. In conditional cash transfer programs, families who are below the poverty line receive cash transfers if and only if they fulfill certain commitments. Those commitments often include their children attending school with high attendance rates over 85%. Sometimes they include periodic check-ins with health clinics, particularly for very young children, and other ways of encouraging human capital. Mexico and Brazil developed these programs first in the middle of the 1990s. Mexico did it in an exciting way from the point of view of a researcher. That is, they did it with an initial large evaluation sample, which included randomly assigning small communities with less than 2,500 people in terms of population, to initially receiving the program or to not receiving the program initially, though they did receive the program eventually, and then collecting extensive data on about 125,000 people who lived in the 308 communities which were subject to this random assignment. This provided the opportunity to compare between the treatment, those that got the new program, and the control groups, those who were similar, but randomly did not get it immediately. And this program, the original program was called Progressa. Subsequently, its name was changed to Oportunidades and Prospera. This program has been immensely influential in the world, partly because of the very systematic evaluation that the Mexican government took a lead on, but which I was fortunate to participate because they contracted with an international organization to do the initial evaluation. That organization was the International Food Policy Research Institute, which was selected because it did a lot of systematic data collection and research, firstly, but secondly, because it was not a lending organization. It was not an organization in which there might be some perceived conflict of interest from the point of view of the Mexican government about obtaining funds. And so I and 3 other international experts from the start were engaged in this program. The program has been, as I said, very influential. There's over 60 programs in over 60 countries that are modeled in some way after it. Its influence has been much greater than the Brazilian program, although the Brazilian program is very similar, but basically because of the systematic evaluation component, which the Brazilian program did not have. There's been literally hundreds of academic articles written using the data from this program. I also think this is an important example because this was a study, a huge study, a number of studies that initiated not with a few academics, in the global north, in Europe or United States or Japan, but was initiated by the Mexican government. The Mexican government thought it could benefit from some of these experts as advisors, but not as key managers, not as people developing and running the program. So this was very much a Mexican program. Partly because of that, its influence in Mexico was enormous. It helped shape policies in Mexico, both the current policies and the way the policies expanded over years. So I think this is the most important sort of social economic experiment that's been conducted in low and middle income countries. And the key person is a Mexican economist named Santiago Levy, Levy. And if anyone hearing this would like to know more, he has written some books about the program, so you can find them under his name.
Mhm. Okay, I have the last question for this axis. You were an economics social science member of the National Institute of Health and also of the National Institute of Child Health and Development. What is the contribution of an economist profile, which is yours, on issues or subjects related to the health?
A very good and very important question. Um, Sometimes we tend to think of health as being the outcome of the formal health sector, hospitals, clinics, doctors, nurses, technicians, and as a sort of biologically technical science. And health has all those characteristics, but estimates in the U.S. and I dare say estimates will show similar things in almost any country, are that if you look at the burden of health problems, at least half that burden relates to human behaviors, such as smoking, other kinds of use of substance, the nature of diets, physical activities, and these human behaviors are very much what economists and other social scientists study. A big issue in the health system in most countries, including the U.S., is that people are in the formal health system are given prescriptions for various medications, but often they don't take them or they don't take them very long. That's one kind of behavior. But there's the other kinds of behaviors I mentioned that are also very important. And the people working in the health system, the formal health system, typically have very little insight into what affects various kinds of behaviors. They also have relatively little insight about how do you interpret data. If they can run an experiment, they can probably run it well, but it will be a very controlled, somewhat small experiment. When you think about a question like, how would a new poverty program affect the health of children in Mexico, to go back to my previous answer, they have an intuition, but they have little in the way of tools of conducting large-scale field experiments or using quasi-experimental methods to learn about the determinants and impact of health. So I've worked a lot with people in the health sector. I believe to our mutual benefit. I've learned a lot, and I believe they have learned a lot. And this has, I think, helped enrich what we know about the determinants and impact of health, including policies, but not limited to policies. To take one very brief example, for several years I've been working with a group of people from the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania on a program in the Latin American country of Peru that deals with a disease called Chagas disease. And Chagas is a viral disease that is spread in part by insects that like to live in houses of humans. And They can be controlled through spraying and other means, but this is a nuisance from the point of view of the house owner. And the effects are important, but they're long run. It's not that you avoid getting sick the next week. Instead, you avoid getting sick in 20 years. And so we've been working on developing behavioral economics ways of encouraging participation by poor families in programs to control this disease, very much in collaboration with the Ministry of Health.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Jere. Now I finished the first axis. If you have anything to add on your professional or consulting experiences.
Just the last thing that you mentioned briefly was about experiences abroad. I just mentioned two in Mexico and Peru, but certainly for my interest and my research, working in low and middle income countries and collaborating with people, researchers primarily, sometimes policymakers in those countries has been critical for the research that I do. Critical, first of all, in understanding what the problems are, how society is thinking of those problems, what the constraints are. In such countries, the resource constraints are much greater than in North America or in Europe. And understanding how to do research to enlighten us as we move forward. To take, again, just a simple but incredibly important topic. In a country like the United States, in the past 2 decades, there's been an explosion of dementia, of Alzheimer's diseases and other diseases, which affect primarily older citizens, and which are very debilitating and which are very costly in terms of research. And there's sort of a tendency to think, well, this is a rich country disease. And there's a little truth to that in the sense that it is a disease of older people, and the populations on average are older in the higher income countries than in the low and middle income countries. But the population shift is rapid everywhere in countries all over the world, the shift towards older populations. And currently, the majority of the world's older population is in low and middle income countries. It's not in Europe, it's not in the US, it's not in Japan. Even though Europe, Japan, the US have, as a percentage of their own population, a larger number of aged than do most low and middle income countries. That gap is closing quickly, and given the much larger population of the low and middle income world, even these diseases of aging are more important actually in low and middle income countries than they are in the higher income countries. More important in the sense that just more people are afflicted by these diseases. So I've been involved in programs trying to understand better what causes dementia, how we might remedy it in countries that range from Malawi in East Africa to Chile in Latin America. Chile at this point is a high income country, but it's developed rapidly over recent decades and been through the experience of many low and middle income countries.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for all this information. Now we move to the second axis, research interests and achievements. Your research interests include various areas, such as empirical macroeconomics, labor economics, human resources, some different aspects, early childhood development, education, health, nutrition, and project evaluation, economic demography, incentive systems, and household behaviors. In this axis, we will discuss each of these areas in depth to know the topics studied, research questions which were explored, and the main contributions you have done. So three components, area and topics and main contributions. Let's start. The first question concerns the area of labor economics. What are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
Let me first note that in certain ways, I think will become obvious in this conversation, my research on these various areas have been intertwined. And that will probably be clear from the start, because in the area of labor economics, my research has focused primarily on the impact of human resources, the second topic, on labor market outcomes. For example, there's a huge literature in the social sciences that relate wages or earnings of laborers to their schooling attainment. And most of this literature is basically using observational data and often large data sets and finding what are the associations between schooling and labor economics. But this area and many areas in economics and social sciences pose problems when you want to know what's the causal effect of schooling attainment on labor market outcomes, which is not the same as the associations. Why not? Because it might be the fact that whatever determines your schooling not only affects wages through schooling, but also has direct impact on wages independent of your schooling. For example, suppose that some people have more abilities than other abilities. Or suppose, related to a point I made earlier, some people had better health and nutrition as young children and learned more in schooling than other people. If you just looked at association between schooling and wages, you would get whatever the impact of schooling was, plus the correlated impact of ability, plus the correlated impact of health and nutrition. So it would be misleading to say that people with more schooling have higher wages because, and only because, they went to school longer. Because in reality, the people who went to school longer tend to have better innate ability. They tend to have family backgrounds which led to greater stimulation at home and in the community. They tend to have backgrounds so they had better health and nutrition. And they tended to go to higher quality schooling. So to give some example more concretely of what kind of results we found, one example would be in work on Brazil. We looked at what happened if first one followed the standard practice and estimated the association between schooling attainment and wages in Brazil. And then secondly, in addition, one controlled for the quality of schooling in Brazil, controlling for the quality of schooling by using as a proxy the average education of the teachers. And the average education of the teachers varies a lot across different parts of Brazil, as it does in most countries. And we found that if we only looked at the association between schooling attainment and wages, we got estimates that were about twice as large as we did when you also controlled for the school quality. We found that the impact of investing in school quality was as important as just expanding the years of schooling. And so that can have important implications for your educational strategy. Or to take another example, been involved in work in the US, but also in other countries, Denmark and China, and Chile, where we use data on twins. So twins, all twins have the advantage in some sense for a social science perspective of being born at the same time. So they were born at the same time their parents were in a certain life cycle stage, at the same time that the local schools were of a given quality, etc. In addition, identical twins have the advantage of sharing identically genetics at the time of conception. So one can look at first, what's the association between, say, wages and schooling, just treating the twins like individuals. But one also can look at what's the relationship between the difference in wages between two twins and the difference in their schooling. And when one does that, you're controlling for all the things the twins share in common, which include their genetic endowments at conception for identical twins, but the family background, the neighborhoods they grew up in, whatever. And C, controlling for all that, what's the impact of schooling on wages? And if you do that for any of the countries I've mentioned, you find that the impact is much smaller, a rate of return of maybe 2 or 3%, rather than estimates of 7 to 10% that are obtained if you only look at the twins as individuals or you look at other individuals. And that's just saying that, not surprisingly, your family background in its multiple dimensions, including the quality of schooling I mentioned before, but also health, nutrition, stimulation, income, family connections, are pretty important, maybe more important than the schooling itself. And you should not confuse, in trying to judge schooling policies, you should not confuse the years of schooling by itself as representing only the effects of schooling.
Okay. Now, question 2 concerns the area of human resources, and especially its relationship with early childhood development, education, health, nutrition. Same concern, what are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
Yes, as I said, my answers are going to be intertwined here, and in a way I talked about some dimensions of this with regard to labor market outcomes. But let me go further and pick a couple dimensions on which to elaborate further. Let me take nutrition last, but I'm going to take an example very parallel to what I was just talking about in terms of using twins data for getting better estimates of the impact of schooling on wages. And that is an important indication of nutrition before you are born is your birth weight. So birth weights vary a lot across children. They also vary a lot across countries. They tend to be lower in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa than in most other parts of the world, for example. And they reflect the conditions that the baby encountered in the womb before birth. And so there's a literature which looked at associations between birth weight and health in childhood, health in adulthood, various outcomes over the life cycle. But a problem with that literature, which is very parallel to the problem with the schooling literature that I mentioned, is the birth weight does include nutrition, but includes also many other things, in particular the health of the mother. And that reflects the circumstances in which mothers find themselves and the income of the household, and whether or not the mother had good access to prenatal care, and whether she had good access to critical vitamins. And so birth weight in studies which only look at the association between birth weight and subsequent outcomes, birth weight is a proxy for many, many things, partly for nutrition in the womb, but partly for these other things. And so, we utilize data, again, on twins and looked at the difference in their birth weights and how they related to difference in life and outcomes over their life cycle. And I should say, that this holds for looking at differences in schooling for twins. I should say it's important that twins do have different birth weights. You know, two twins that are part of the same twinship often have similar birth weights, but they can have substantially varied birth weights as well. Why is that? Well, biologically, one twin was located closer to the placenta of the mother than the other twin and got better nutrition. And it's just, you can call it sibling rivalry, but sibling rivalry before birth in the womb. And that means that twins often have different birth weights, not because their mothers had different prenatal care. They had the same mother. Not because their mother was healthy or not, they had the same mother, or better off in income or not, they had the same mother, but because they were located differentially in the womb and got differential nutrition. So we had data on twins, on their birth weight, and on outcomes, until they were in their 50s or 60s, and could look at the impact of just the improved nutrition on these outcomes using this twins approach. And we found results that were fairly different than previous conventional wisdom. For example, we did not find any particular association between birth weight and height, which many people thought existed, once you controlled for all the common elements of family background, including, of course, the average genetics of the parents. But we found stronger effects on education and on adult incomes than the purely associational studies had. And that's because that would be consistent with parents there's a question, parents have children of different birth weights. What do they do about it? Do they invest more in the child with higher birth weight or lower birth weight? Do they reinforce the difference, or do they compensate for the difference? And in most societies, the result is they reinforce a bit, reinforce some, sometimes a lot. And then that can affect, these effects I'm talking about are not only the effects of birth weight per se, but of behaviors in response to birth weights over the life cycle. So that would be one example. Another example is a study that we're still actively involved in, and that's in the first category of childhood development. There's been a literature which originally came out of some studies in the country of Jamaica in the Caribbean about providing children with early life stimulation, basically teaching parents how to teach their children to learn better. And these studies look like they have long-run effects over many years, but they were done originally with a very small sample, and they were done originally with the teachers being well-trained child development psychologists. And of course, that may be useful to know if you are in a high enough income country. But if you're in a low-income country where people with that training are going to be fairly rare, there's an important question of, can one get similar results by using less extensively trained teachers? And can one do it in a way so you can scale up interventions? So that was the background for a randomized controlled trial we have conducted in the state of Odisha in India, where there was, first of all, a control group. Secondly, a group that had home visits. Third, a group that had group sessions. The home visits were by local women who had been trained, but trained, for a few days or weeks, not years, to deliver this program. And the group sessions were run by similar women. And we found that both the home visits and the group sessions on average increased the cognitive skills and the social emotional development of children. Children originally were 9 to 24 months of age. This program went on for a couple of years. Both of them, both interventions increased by about a third of a standard deviation, which is a fair amount. So they both look promising. But what was perhaps most interesting, most important, is that the group sessions on average were about as promising as the individual sessions. So why is that important? Well, the group sessions, one teacher has 8 mothers. In the home visits, one teacher has 1 mother. So the group sessions are much cheaper to run and therefore permit the possibility of scaling up to larger populations. So we think that is an important result. My problem is I've been involved in too many studies.
Yes.
Let me take one last one here in this group. As you and I communicated about before, this is the area where much of my research has been, so a little more time on this group may make sense. So another example, I'll take one in terms of education, and in a way this will bring in at one dimension of question 4 on incentive systems. So there's a lot of educational literature which seems to think the problem is children aren't better educated because they don't have the right inputs. They don't have enough textbooks. They don't have material to work with. Schools construction is not good. Teachers are not trained enough. But efforts at trying to see how important those kinds of inputs are undertaken by various economists, particularly Eric Hanushek, Hanushek at Stanford, cast doubt about how important most of these are. When you really try to look seriously at their impact on outcomes, you don't find much, if anything. An alternative explanation could be that students and teachers and their parents maybe too, are just don't have very good incentives for learning, for putting in time to learn, or putting in time to teach from the point of view of the teachers. So we conducted a large randomized control trial in Mexico in collaboration with the Ministry of Education in Mexico, where for about 45,000 secondary school students, we provided either one, incentives for the students, financial incentives, if over the year they learn more mathematics. Two, incentives for the teachers, but only for the teachers, if their students over the year learn more mathematics. Or three, incentives for both students and teachers, if the students over the year learn more mathematics. Or four, a control group. And in this experiment, we found fairly large effects, something like 0.6 standard deviation in mathematics, if the students and the teachers received incentives. Large but smaller, more like 0.4 standard deviations, if only the students received incentives. And basically no impact if only the teachers received incentives. This is interesting for several reasons. One reason it was interesting is before we ran this program, we met with various teachers to try to get their perception of why the students did not learn more. And a lot of the students said, I'm doing my best, I'm working hard, but the students are just not interested. And unless you can get the students interested, it's not going to work. And it seems like our results were consistent with that outcome. That if you gave students incentives, there were significant effects, even larger if you gave both students and teachers incentives, but no effects if you just gave the incentives to the teachers. I'm going to elaborate on one more point of this experiment because I think it's very interesting and very relevant. And that is when you create incentives, you create incentives for behaviors of various sorts. Arguably, if you create incentives for learning as measured, say, by test scores, you create incentives for teachers to teach to the tests. This criticism is raised often. Rather than just teaching mathematics, they teach you the mathematics you need to do well on the test. And also, arguably, it creates incentives for teachers or students or both to cheat on the test, to copy students to copy from other students, for example, or for teachers to provide answers to the test. So in this case, the tests that we used were based on the curriculum. So we don't think there was such a problem of teaching to the test, because if you teach to the curriculum, you're teaching to the test, and that doesn't seem to be cause a lot of problems. But we did do some statistical tests, maybe more in your area, of looking at the patterns in the test scores among students. And by looking at systematic patterns in questions that were answered wrongly by students, uncovered what seemed to be, in a small number of schools, evidence of fairly extensive copying by students. We took all sorts of precautions to try to avoid that. The tests, for example, were not given by teachers. The monitors were people from the state Ministry of Education. They weren't local people. We collected all the tests afterwards. We did the things they tell you to do to try to limit this. We did not have different randomized tests for different students, which would have eliminated this problem. We had the same test for different students and found these copying patterns. So the results I told you are corrected for some copying that occurred. It was concentrated in a few schools, but it made a difference in the overall results. And I think the bottom line of that experience is to reinforce that people respond to incentives. They may respond in ways that are good. They may respond in ways that you don't anticipate, or in ways that are bad. So should I go on to economic demography?
Yes, yes. This is what is about the third area, economic demography. The same question, the most important topics studied, and the main contributions achieved.
So, in a way, this will repeat some of the points I've tried to make up to this point in our conversation. Traditional demography is concerned with the quantity of the population. The quantity of the population depends upon the number of births, the number of deaths, the mortality rate. And if you're talking about the population of, say, a country like Morocco, the migration in or out of the country. I mean, this is just a simple arithmetic statement, that the population goes up when fertility goes up, it goes down when mortality goes down, it goes up. It goes up if the in-migration increases, or vice versa with immigration. And there's lots of important insights that are gained in traditional demography. But there's little focus on what I would call the quality of the population as opposed to the quantity. And by quality, I mean very much the human resources that I mentioned before. The health, nutrition, the education of the population. Furthermore, outcomes in demography that we observe depend not simply on sort of simplistic models, but depend upon behaviors of individuals. For example, human fertility in reality is way below the conceptual biological fertility. Why? Well, in the economist jargon, because people make lots of choices which limit their fertility. The one important dimension of economic demography is trying to understand behaviors related to fertility, related to mortality, related to international migration. And this is kind of related to this whole axis about how do we understand what determines people's behaviors? How do we understand what are the outcomes that are affected by these behaviors? So let me give just one brief example, although some of the things that we've talked about already would fit into the economic demography category. But the example I'll refer to is, well, I give an example for the country of Malawi in East Africa. I've been involved in Malawi with a group of people collecting socioeconomic data and analyzing it for 25 years or something. Mm-hmm. And so one question we looked at was what determines whether or not people use modern contraceptives in Malawi to limit their fertility. And in particular, how important are people's social networks? How important is it with whom a person interacts? And we collected relatively rich data in Malawi, also in Kenya, on people's social networks. So from every person, we collect a lot of data about themselves, but also, okay, with whom do you interact regularly? What's their schooling, their occupation? What do you talk about? Whatever. And there are a number of more sociologists who think these social networks are really important in spreading new forms of demographic behavior, new forms of family control, different ages of marriage, different ways of dealing with health and nutrition. So what we found was, they were partly right. We had data following the same individuals over various years, so we could control, akin to what I was saying about twins, we could control for unobserved individual characteristics of the individuals by looking at changes in their behavior over time. And we found that some of these people lived in communities which were very closed. And it's true that their social networks reinforce their contraceptive behavior, but they're reinforced it by keeping fertility high. They got reinforcement, no, it's bad to use these modern methods. You should have as many children as God wants or whatever. And so in a closed community, the social networks reinforce the status quo, not change. And then there were other communities which, because of the nature of markets, were much more open and integrated with the broader society. In those communities, social networks also reinforced behaviors of individuals, but by introducing new behaviors, introducing use of modern contraceptives, modern health practice, etc. So in those communities, contraceptive use was much higher and fertility much lower.
Okay, and now for the question 4, which concerns the area of incentive systems and household behaviors. The same question, the important topics and the main contributions.
So here I'll take one example that I talked about before and just elaborated on a bit. And that example is the conditional cash transfer programs, such as in Mexico. And those programs explicitly, tried to create incentives for households to invest more in their children. Why? Because, as I said, you were given cash transfers if your children were in school, if your children had regular health checkups, etc. And in that instance, we found fairly substantial effects on schooling, increases in the amount of schooling approaching an additional grade of schooling for children from poor families who were in these incentive systems. But also, these incentive systems only looked at whether or not the children attended school or attended health clinics, but let's focus on attending school. And as I just said, as a result, the students stayed in school longer. But presumably what we want out of education is not time in school, but learning. How much did the children learn? And so a criticism of these programs has been that they did not encourage learning per se. And we have done some recent further research with enriched data where we have information on learning. And we find that indeed, in fact, these programs did induce some additional learning, but not nearly as much as in the other program I described to you, where we gave incentives directly for improved test scores. So I think that's consistent with, yes, households and individuals are responsive to incentives, but they're responsive very much to exactly what incentives you give them. So if you want students to learn more, you should direct the incentives to learning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a lot of areas of research, large wallet that you have, Dr. Jere. Congratulations. Question 5. The last question for this second axis concerns the tools, equations, and models to explore questions in human and social sciences. To deal with and explore the topics of empirical microeconomics, quantitative methods and techniques are used. Several practical tools are in hand. Today, are these tools sufficient to address and to solve the current problems, and what is your opinion on the alignment between the theoretical aspects and the practical aspects of these tools, equations and modeling?
Certainly, the tools have steadily increased substantially over the decades. I should say, as I've hinted at, that one critical element of tool is data, is information. And data have gotten much better in low and middle income countries and in high income countries. In particularly useful are longitudinal data, which follows individuals over long periods of time. Since for my interest, but I think more broadly, lots of things that happen of interest happen in households, or there may be effects that occur across household members. Having detailed data on various household members is very useful and valuable for a set of questions. Also, having valuable data on, I mentioned the quality of schooling in Brazil, on the quality of educational and health services and nutritional services is very important. Sometimes special data like the twins data I mentioned can be important. So I would first of all emphasize that very, very critical has been and will continue to be the expansion of data. Because new problems will exist, that's going to require, for satisfactory analysis, collecting new data, new approaches. I mean, you take a very obvious example, the COVID-19 pandemic has created many problems, and to analyze those, one needs data on COVID-19 and the behaviors associated with it. Or to take another example I referred to before, cognitive decline among aging people is an exploding problem. Many data sets historically have focused on younger populations, but as populations age, it's important to look at the aging people. In addition, data is critical. You can't do much quantitative analysis without data. I mean, you can always do Monte Carlo experiments, etc., but not much. At the same time, there's been steady advancement in terms of modeling, including modeling behaviors and how modeling relates to estimation procedures. And these are very important as well as data. We know much more than we knew 2 decades ago, but there's so much that we don't know that I think further development in terms of data, in terms of modeling, and in terms of statistics and econometrics will continue to be critical. So the tools are much better now than they were 20 years ago. Hopefully they'll be much better in another 20 years than they are now.
Okay, Dr. Jere, if you want to add more about your research interests and contributions.
I think that covers a fair amount of ground, so let's move on.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jere. Now we move to the third axis, the nature of experts' career. This axis is about the academic and professional route. My first question, we know that the success factors are diverse and quite numerous. Some are intrinsic and others are extrinsic. What are the most important success factors that help to create your academic or professional paths?
Well, I think fortunately for me, my road had, I'm sure, some rocks and obstacles, but it had a lot of flowers. One of the flowers was something over which we have, as individuals, no control, and that was the timing of my birth. I was born such that when I came out of my academic training, there was great demand and expansion in the US, but I think more broadly internationally in universities, in research institutes. So that made my options broader and more available than might be the case for someone coming out of academic training today. And that's something over which we don't have control, but I think realistically, people in my generation have to try to understand people in the generation who are currently in their 20s and 30s. Their world is very different in many dimensions, but one is in the much less expanding demand for academics, for researchers. And so that puts a different set of constraints on their existence.
And if any negative in your career, are there any difficulties, problems, or obstacles that have negatively affected your academic or professional paths?
Well, I would to reiterate what I said on the positive side. I think I've been blessed with much more positive than negative. Again, there have been issues. Let me just say, from the greater scheme of things, this seems kind of minor, but when you're an academic, such as you and I, this is more important. As academics such as us, we do research, we write papers, we hope that these papers can positively influence knowledge and what goes on. And one of the mechanisms we use is peer-reviewed journals. We submit papers to journals. We hope that they're as enthusiastic as we are about the papers. And of course, we all find at times that we think this is a great paper, a great idea, that we executed it well, and this particular editor or reviewers do not think it's worth accepting for publication in their journal. But I think the learning side of that is a little humility is probably good for all of us. But beyond that, I had an idea I thought was really good and well presented, and the reviewer didn't see it that way. And so the question is, why did the reviewer not see it that way? Now you could say, and I think our first reaction is, oh, the reviewer was dumb, or the reviewer didn't spend enough time, or something like that. But almost for sure it goes, that may or may not be the case, but that's not very helpful. That you have not developed your idea as well as you think you did, or you have not communicated about it as well as you did. And so I think it's important to take those relatively small negative experiences and reflect upon how they can lead to you to improve your research. And hopefully the next time it's submitted in a revised, improved version, it will be viewed more positively.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jere. Now we move to the third axis, perceptions and projections toward the future. The first question, briefly, what are the contributions that you consider the most important of your academic career and your various consultations?
The general response is trying to provide as good as possible empirical evidence on a number of issues which guide people's perceptions of reality, but also guide policy decisions. So one example early in my career, in the time of my early career, which is, you can observe, was a number of years ago, there was a widespread view, first, that peasants or farmers were not responsive to incentives. And secondly, that planning could improve economies a lot. And given that poor farmers were not responsive to incentives, and that the perceived way to development was much more through developing manufacturing, one can squeeze the agricultural sector by just keeping prices low. Keep the price of rice really low, and farmers in Thailand or the Philippines or other rice producing countries will provide the rice anyway. And you can take the surplus that you squeeze out of the agricultural sector and invest it in manufacturing and have a further growth. And many countries had explicit policies and plans consistent with that. And I would say the first major contribution of my career was to look carefully at peasant farmers that happened to be in one of the countries I mentioned, Thailand, and see to what extent the evidence was consistent with them being responsive or not to prices, to price variations, to technological change. And Thailand's a country where there are many peasant farmers. It's not a plantation country. And yet, my results and results of some other people working at the time in other countries led to a much broader perception now that, yes, farmers do respond to incentives. And so if you try to make food cheap by keeping the price of foodstuff low, you're just going to discourage production of food. So that would be an important kind of example.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Okay, Jerry. Now also I want to have a response with the brief manner, please. Do you have any open question or problem that has not yet been of empirical microeconomics or other field?
Yes, I mean, the trouble here again is the answer is yes, very many. I think one thing that economists can do usefully is, keep an eye on demographic movements. Economists often seem to come late to the question of various big demographic changes. Currently, a huge one, as I mentioned before, is the aging of populations. And that has implications for individuals and for governments throughout the world. And I think economists that put more focus on those questions are likely to find themselves contributing more to what we know.
Okay. Also, with the brief manner, what are the middle and long-term economic consequences of three current crises? One, the COVID-19 pandemic. Two, the current war between Russia and Ukraine. And three, the current tensions between the West and Russia.
And I think the potential are enormous for all three. Let me tie back to some of my research on the COVID-19 pandemic for an example. There has been some work at the World Bank and elsewhere showing that the reduction in formal schooling, kindergarten, typically they go through secondary schooling, these sorts of things, kindergarten through age 15 or age 18, something like this, is likely to have substantial negative impacts on productivity in the longer run in various economies, even even long after COVID-19 disappears or more likely becomes endemic, and we just live with it. We've done some work looking at preschool programs and find even larger effects because that's such a critical period of life in terms of neural development and intellectual development, and find very large negative persistent effects of COVID-19 and of the related closing of preschools, which was to a certain degree almost universal. Different regions adapted more or less quickly. But there's many other dimensions of the epidemic or of the current war or the current tensions. I mean, one dimension of the war between Russia and Ukraine, which fits in with a lot of what I've been talking about, and also with your next question, is Russia and Ukraine are very important producers of basic grains, particularly wheat, and of inputs into agriculture, such as nitrates. And so the current war and the blockade that Russia has imposed has reduced notably food supplies in the international market. And probably the most vulnerable group are children, young children. And so there may be some long-run consequences. I would predict there will be long-run consequences of that reduction in food supply through less good nutrition for poor children very broadly, geographically.
So, Jere, another question. In the future, what will be determinants and the impacts of education, health, and nutrition? In other sense, will we have the same results that you have established before since the early 1980s in examining different relationships? For example, the relationship between nutrition and income growth, the relationship between health and nutrition, the relationship between child health and school enrollment, and others.
So I think I think you're asking a very good question, and that most likely the knowledge explosion and digital revolution will continue to expand and will have very important impacts in a variety of ways on the kind of human resources on which I've focused. For one example, widely in the world, governments have various policies and programs to try to help to improve the nutrition and education of children. But also very commonly in these programs, there's lots of leakage. A lot of resources get diverted towards administrative ends or maybe illegal diversions. And certainly the kind of work that's underway in many low and middle income countries now to digitize these programs, I think has legitimate potential for reducing such leakages and for improving the targeting these program towards the poor members of society. Now, as always, there may be unintended consequences. For example, it may be the case that some programs that appear to be directed towards the poor really benefit very much middle, upper income people. And we think of that as leakage and not good targeting. But it also may mean that society as a whole will politically be more in support of those programs than they would have been if it only went to the poor. So, making these programs more efficient might, in part, reduce political support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question. What are your ambitions and future plans?
Yes, I think for me, being an economist, working interdisciplinary with people in other fields like demography, health, nutrition, education, psychology, being involved in a number of low and middle income countries where there's different contexts, different problems, and living in an era where there have been substantial improvements in the possibilities of doing research because of data improvements, computer improvements, digitalization more generally, and analytical improvements. It's all been very good, very, very exciting, and I'm happy to continue along that path as long as I'm capable of it.
Okay. Final question, Dr. Jere Behrman, if you have any ending words before close this episode.
Basically, just thank you for inviting me for this interview. I hope it has been useful for its purposes. For me, it's been fun, sometimes a little challenging to think about how would I answer this question or answer that question, but I've tried to do so within my overall broad perspective, and hopefully it will be useful for others, or at least entertaining.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jere Behrman. Now we are coming to the end of the episode 6 of the Voice of the Expert program, in which we had the honor of inviting our dear guest, Dr. Jere Behrman. Thank you, Jere, for having responded favorably to the invitation and for having enriched the discussion by rich and varied information from your academic and professional career. All the luck and success for your future activities. Thank you again, and best and goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you.
Thank you.